Competitive Exclusion Principle. Competitive Exclusion Principle states that the complete competitors cannot coexist. Complete competitors means that the two species that live in the same place and have exactly the same ecological requirements. Also, the competitive exclusion principle involves assumptions about species involved as well as the environment in which they exist. First, it assumes that the competitors have exactly the same resources requirements, and second, it assumes that the environment condition remains constant. Competition is also influenced by non-resource factors. Environmental factors such as water pH, soil, or temperature other than resources also directly influence the growth and the reproduction of species and therefore can influence the outcome of competition interaction. For example, one research study by Taniguchi and his colleagues examined the influence of water temperature on the relative competitive ability of three fish species. At 3 degrees Celsius, brook trout exhibit the highest rate of food consumption. At 24 degrees Celsius, food intake by brook trout dropped to zero, whereas the intake rate of brown still exceeded that of the creek chub. At 26 degrees Celsius, the rate of food intake reversed for the two species, and the food intake by creek chub exceeded that of the brown. The result of Taniguchi and his colleagues provide a clear example of temperature mediation of competitive interaction. The relative competitive ability of the three fish species for limiting food resources are directly influenced by a biotic condition, and that is the water temperature.
Temporal variation in the environment influences competitive interactions. When one species is more efficient at exploiting a shared, limiting resource, it may be able to exclude the other species. However, when environmental conditions vary through time, the competitive advantages may also change, and as a result, no one species will be able to displace its competitors. In this manner, environmental variation allows competitors to coexist. We will examine two different species of grass to provide an example of shifting competitive ability resulting from temporal variation in resource availability. If you could look at this figure, this is a graph that shows the occurrence of two species of grass over a period of 10 years. From 1971 to 1973, the dominant grass species between the two is the Eurocloa. However, from 1973 up to the remaining years of the decade, a shift in the dominance can be observed. Heteropogon became the dominant species. Researchers found out that this observed shift in dominance was a result of yearly variation in resource availability, in this case, rainfall. Eurocloa can maintain higher rates of survival and growth under dry conditions than Heteropogon, making it a better competitor under conditions of low rainfall. Rainfall during the 1971 to 1973 was much lower than average, which is a better or a more suitable environment for Eurocloa to survive. But with return to higher rainfall during the remaining years of the decade, the Heteropogon contorsus became the dominant grass species. The researchers found that the yearly variation in the environment has an effect in the variations in species performance, and that this year-to-year variation in the competitive abilities of the species functioned to buffer species from competitive exclusion. Aside from that, variation in the environment can also function as a density-independent limitation on population growth, reducing or even eliminating competition as a result. Competition also occurs for multiple resources. In many cases, competition between species involves multiple resources, and competition for one resource often influences an organism's ability to access other resources. Competition among plants provide many examples of how competition for one resource can influence an individual's ability to exploit other essential resources. You can see here two different plants, the skeleton weed and the subterranean clover, grown in two separate pots. This is how they normally grow without competition for above ground and below ground resources. In this slide, we will examine a research experiment on competition between the subterranean clover and the skeleton weed. There are three setups in this experiment, and in the first setup, both the subterranean clover and the skeleton weed are grown in the same pot. However, the shoots were separated by a divider, eliminating the competition for the above ground resources or the light, while the roots share the below ground resources or the water and nutrients. On the second experiment setup, the shoots share resources while the roots were separated. And on the third, both the shoots and the roots share above ground and below ground resources. From the experiment, we can observe in the three setups that the clover was not affected by the presence of the skeleton weed. However, the skeleton weed was significantly affected. In the first setup, when the roots share water and nutrients, the growth of the skeleton weed was reduced by 35% compared to how it grows without competition. In the second setup, when the shoots shared light, the growth of the skeleton weed was reduced by 53%. And in the third setup, when both the shoots and roots share resources, the growth of the skeleton weed was reduced by 69%. Obviously, we can see here that the clover plants were the superior competitors for both above ground and below ground resources, resulting in a combined effect of competition for these two resources. The species with the faster growth rate, or the clover, grows taller than the slow-growing species, or the skeleton weed, reducing the skeleton weed's available light, reducing also its growth and demand for below-ground resources. And the result is increased access to resources and further growth by the superior competitor, or, in this experiment, the subterranean clover. The results of the experiment show a clear pattern of interactions between competition for above and below ground resources. In general, increased competition for below ground resources functions to reduce growth rates, and the result of which is reduced competitive ability for light or the above ground resources.